Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are pulling apart a phrase that sits right at the intersection of bureaucracy and bulldozers.
hmm
It is a term you have likely heard thrown around in city council meetings, seen on campaign flyers, or maybe read on a placard at a construction site. Urban renewal.
It's a fascinating term, isn't it? Just, linguistically, renewal.
Right.
It sounds so incredibly benign. It evokes spring cleaning or a spa day or maybe, fixing a leaky roof. It sounds like something absolutely no one could possibly object to.
Exactly. I mean, who is pro-decay? Nobody. But when you actually dig into the sources we have today, and we have a massive stack here, we're talking global policy documents, Supreme Court transcripts, historical records from the 19th century, the story isn't quite so rosy.
No.
Urban renewal is a concept that hides a history of, well, dynamite, mass displacement, and some of the most intense ideological battles over how human beings should live together.
It is a euphemism that does a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, on the surface, the premise is simple. Take a neighborhood that is struggling, physically, economically, socially, and make it better.
Right.
But the core question, the one that runs through every single document we are looking at today, is better for whom?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is it better for the people living there or better for the people who want to be living there? Our mission today is to unpack that tension. The tension between progress, the shiny new skyscrapers, the convention centers, the 6-lane highways, and place.
And place means the actual community, the history.
The messy, complex networks of people who call those so-called blighted areas home.
And we are going to see that word blight come up over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It is the engine that drives this whole machine.
Before we get into the history, let's actually stick a pin in that word. Because words matter in policy, and blight is a heavy one.
They really do. I mean, blight is originally a biological or an agricultural term.
Like on a plant.
Exactly. It refers to a plant disease, a fungus, something that infects a crop and kills it from the inside out. Or it refers to, gangrenous tissue on a body. So when urban planners and politicians started applying that specific word to neighborhoods in the early 20th century, they were doing something very psychological.
They were pathologizing the city.
Precisely. They were framing it as a disease.
Right, because if a neighborhood is just poor, maybe you send aid. If a neighborhood is diseased,
You cut it out, you excise it, you don't negotiate with a tumor.
wow.
So by labeling a neighborhood as blighted, you are implicitly justifying a radical and often destructive intervention. You are saying that the area is not just struggling, but that it is a threat to the health of the entire city.
Okay, so let's define the scope here. When we say urban renewal, or sometimes you hear urban regeneration or redevelopment, what is the actual technical definition? Are we talking about fixing potholes, or are we talking about leveling entire city blocks?
Well, technically, it covers the whole spectrum. At its core, urban renewal is any initiative, usually state-led or state-enabled, that's meant to address urban decay.
Right.
On the really mild end of the spectrum, you have micro-renovation.
Micro-renovation.
So that's upgrading infrastructure, better sewers, new streetlights, fixing facades on buildings. You keep the buildings, you keep the people, you just make the environment work a little better.
But that's not usually what makes the history books.
No, not at all. On the other far end of the spectrum, you have slum clearance.
Right.
And this is the tabula rasa approach, the blank slate. You designate an area as completely unsalvageable, you evict the population, you demolish every structure, and you build something entirely new on top of the ruins.
And that is where the conflict really explodes, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that clash between economic revitalization, bringing tax base and capital back into a city, and the raw reality of displacement.
It is about power. At the end of the day, it's about who has the power to look at a map, draw a line, and say, this stays and this goes. And historically, the people living in the this goes zones have not been the ones holding the pen.
Now, I think most people, when they hear this, they associate the concept with the 1950s. The era of Robert Moses, big highways, concrete housing blocks. But our sources suggest the DNA of urban renewal goes back much, much further.
Oh, way further. We have to start in the 19th century, right in the smog of the Industrial Revolution. If you look at cities like London, Manchester, or even early industrial New York, they were undergoing this terrifying transformation. Industrialization was just sucking people in from the countryside by the millions.
That classic Dickensian nightmare scenario.
It really was. You had extreme overcrowding, basically zero sanitation, frequent cholera outbreaks, soot and smoke everywhere. And the reaction to this among the ruling classes was it was a mix of genuine concern for public health
Sure.
and a very heavy dose of moral panic.
Moral panic. What do you mean by that?
There was this progressive doctrine that emerged in Victorian England, and the belief was that the physical squalor of the slums was directly causing moral squalor. If people lived in filth, they would become filthy citizens. Therefore, if you improved the housing, you could actually morally reform the poor.
So it wasn't just, let's stop the rats from spreading disease. It was, let's make them into proper, upstanding British subjects by giving them better bricks and plumbing.
Exactly. It was social engineering through architecture. And you see this with figures like George Peabody and the Peabody Trust. In the mid-19th century, they targeted this notorious slum in Westminster called the Devil's Acre.
The Devil's Acre. That's a subtle name. I assume the realtors didn't come up with that one.
I think it's safe to say they did not. It was a rough place. The trust bought it, cleared it, and built what they called model dwellings.
Okay.
These were sturdy brick estates. They had shared laundry facilities, courtyards, and compared to the slum they replaced, they were miracles of hygiene and order. But the underlying philosophy was deeply paternalistic.
It was the wealthy deciding how the poor should live.
Yes, it was about imposing order from the outside.
Speaking of imposing order, we have to talk about Paris. Because when I think of Paris, I think of romance and croissants and these wide, beautiful boulevards. I don't think of urban renewal. But the Paris we see today is actually the result of one of the most aggressive renewal projects in history.
Oh, absolutely. What we call Haussmann's Paris. In 1853, Napoleon III ordered Baron Haussmann to modernize the city. At the time, Paris was still essentially medieval, a maze of narrow, winding streets, incredibly dense, very dark.
And Haussmann didn't just tweak it, he sliced through it.
He carved those massive boulevards right through the existing neighborhoods. He didn't go around them. He went through them.
What was the scale of that?
He demolished roughly 19,000 buildings.
Wow.
Displaced thousands and thousands of people. And while the stated goals were, better airflow, sanitation, and traffic circulation, there's a very clear military objective, too.
The barricades.
The barricades, exactly.
Yeah.
France had a long, long history of revolutions, 1830, 1848, and it is very easy to block a narrow, winding medieval street with furniture and cobblestones to fight off the army.
Right.
It is very, very hard to block a boulevard that is 80 feet wide. Haussmann's avenues were designed to be difficult to barricade and very easy to fire cannons down.
So urban renewal as a counterinsurgency strategy, that is a wild connection I had never made.
It's all about state control over the urban environment, and this idea of sanitizing the city for both health and political reasons. It hopped the Atlantic to the U.S. in the 1890s with what was called the City Beautiful movement.
This was the era of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, right? The famous White City.
Yes, that was the model. The American upper middle class looked at their industrial cities, which were becoming crowded and smoky and full of immigrants, and they decided they needed a facelift. They wanted neoclassical architecture, grand monuments, sweeping civic centers.
They wanted American cities to look like Rome or Paris.
Exactly. But again, to build a grand civic center or a massive parkway, you have to put it somewhere.
And that somewhere was usually where the poorest people live.
Almost always. The City Beautiful movement really established the precedent in the U.S. that aesthetics and this vague notion of civic virtue could trump the property rights of the poor.
Okay, so that's the prologue. A century of establishing the idea. But the main event, the era of the sledgehammer, really kicks off in the 20th century. And the catalyst, as it seems to be for everything in modern history, was World War II.
The war broke the world, and it had to be put back together. In Europe, reconstruction was brutally literal. Cities like London, Berlin, Rotterdam, Warsaw, they were just piles of rubble. They didn't have a choice. They had to rebuild from scratch.
And this gave the urban planners a blank slate that they'd only dreamed of before.
It really did. It was the golden age of functionalism. Architects like Le Corbusier had been arguing for decades that the old city was obsolete, that it was unhealthy and inefficient.
He wanted the tower in the park, right?
The tower in the park. High-rise residential blocks, completely separated from industrial zones, all connected by high-speed roads. No more messy, mixed-use streets where people lived above the shop. Order and separation were key.
So in the UK, you get the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, which leads to the building of the new towns and the big council estates. In France, you get the grands ensembles on the outskirts of Paris.
Correct. But here's the critical divergence. The United States was not bombed.
Right.
We did not have rubble in our city centers. We had intact, functioning if crowded cities, but American planners and politicians adopted the exact same logic of reconstruction.
They treated their own cities as if they had been destroyed by war.
They treated the slums as an internal enemy that had to be defeated with the same kind of total war mentality that they had just used on external enemies. And the mechanism they created to do this was the Housing Act of 1949.
I want to drill down on this act, because the financial structure of it seems to be the key to understanding why everything happened the way it did. It wasn't just the government building houses, was it?
No, and that's a really common misconception. The Housing Act of 1949 created a partnership, a mechanism, where the federal government provided loans and grants to cities.
Okay.
The cities then used that money to exercise eminent domain, that's the power to take private property for public use, to acquire all the land in a designated slum area. Then, the city would pay to clear the land, demolish the buildings, and prepare the site for new construction.
So the taxpayer bears the full cost of the destruction and the site prep.
100% correct. And then, and this is the kicker, the city would sell that cleared, prepped land to a private developer at a huge discount. It was called the write-down.
So it was a massive subsidy for private development. You're basically saying the public absorbs the loss and the private developer gets cheap, clean land to build on.
That's precisely it. The argument at the time was that the cost of buying and clearing slum land was just too high for the free market to handle on its own. No developer would buy a block of tenements, evict 500 tenants, and tear it all down. It just wouldn't be profitable.
So the government stepped in to do the dirty work.
They did the dirty work, and they absorbed the financial loss, effectively assembling the land for private capital to then swoop in and profit from.
And then the Housing Act of 1954 comes along and kind of rebrands it, right?
It does. It shifted the terminology from urban redevelopment to the much friendlier sounding urban renewal.
There's that word again.
It also introduced FHA-backed mortgages for these new developments, which just greased the wheels even further. It made it incredibly, incredibly profitable to destroy the old and build the new.
But we have to ask the question, who was living in the old? When the planners and politicians drew those red lines around the blighted areas on the map, who were they circling?
The data is stark and it's completely undeniable. The Blight label was overwhelmingly disproportionately targeted at Black and immigrant neighborhoods.
This brings us to the human cost. I mean, we can talk about legislation and finance all day, but the reality on the ground was families watching their homes, their churches, their businesses get bulldozed.
James Baldwin, the great novelist and social critic, he didn't mince words. In an interview in the 1960s, he famously said, "Urban renewal is Negro removal."
That's a gut punch of a phrase.
It was a play on words, but it was statistically accurate. In city after city, African-American communities were displaced at rates far, far higher than any other group. And the deep tragedy was that, especially in the early years under that 1949 Act, there was often no legal requirement to provide any replacement housing.
So they just evicted them? It was just, here's a check for your house, now get out.
Essentially. And usually the check was for the fair market value of a home in an area that the government itself had just declared blighted, which was, peanuts.
So it's not enough to buy anything comparable anywhere else?
Not even close. So these families were pushed out of their communities, their social networks were shattered, and they were forced to find housing in other parts of the city. But because of segregation and redlining, their options were severely limited. They usually ended up squeezing into already overcrowded neighborhoods nearby.
Which just spreads the overcrowding and the blight to new areas.
It created a vicious cycle.
Let's look at some specific case studies here, because the scale of this is hard to grasp without concrete examples.
Yeah.
The outline mentions Berman v. Parker. This was a Supreme Court case involving Southwest Washington, D.C.
This is a landmark moment, a crucial turning point. In the 1950s, planners targeted Southwest D.C. It was a predominantly African-American neighborhood, working class. They argued it was unsanitary and blighted.
Okay.
They utilized eminent domain to seize all the properties. The plaintiffs, the homeowners, argued, hey, my specific building isn't blighted, my department store is fine, you can't take it just because the neighborhood around it is poor.
That seems like a reasonable argument. What did the Supreme Court say?
They ruled against the homeowners unanimously. They established the principle that the government could take property not just for a specific public structure like a school or a road, but for the broader, more abstract goal of community redevelopment.
It greenlit the entire practice.
It absolutely did. It gave the constitutional green light to wholesale clearance of entire neighborhoods. And in Southwest D.C., Thousands of families were displaced. The historic community was just erased.
And it wasn't just D.C. The notes mention the Hill District in Pittsburgh.
The Hill District was a cultural phenomenon. I mean, it was known as the Harlem of Pittsburgh. It was the center of the jazz scene, home to playwright August Wilson, a place with a deep, vibrant social fabric.
How many people live there?
About 8,000 residents. The city declared it blighted and cleared nearly 100 acres.
And what did they build? What was so important that it justified wiping out a community of 8,000 people?
The Civic Arena.
Yeah.
A sports venue.
They traded a community of 8,000 people for a hockey rink.
A hockey rink and a massive parking lot. And this is what we mean when we talk about that tension between progress and place. To the city planners, a shiny new arena was progress. It put Pittsburgh on the map. It brought in suburban dollars for games. But to the people of the Hill District, it was the erasure of their entire world. The collective memory of that place was just severed.
We see the same story in eastern Pennsylvania with the destruction of Syriantown, which was a multi-ethnic hub. We see it in almost every single major American city. But there was another tool of renewal being built at the same time that was arguably even more destructive than the housing projects.
The highway.
The Interstate Highway.
The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This was the largest public works project in American history. The stated goal was to connect the country for commerce and defense. But in the cities, the goal was to facilitate the suburban commute.
Bring the white-collar workers in from the suburbs in the morning, get them out at night.
Exactly. But to bring a 6- or 8-lane freeway into the center of a dense city requires a massive amount of land. And the planners had to decide where to put these highways.
And they followed the path of least political resistance.
Of course. Which means they didn't bulldoze the wealthy neighborhoods.
They didn't go through the country club district.
No, those people had lawyers and political connections. They
replaced tax-paying neighborhoods with tax-exempt concrete.
Precisely. It accelerated the very decline they were supposedly trying to stop.
It is a heavy, heavy history. But people didn't just, take it lying down. There was a backlash. And you can't talk about the backlash without talking about Jane Jacobs.
The patron saint of the sidewalk, an absolute legend.
So, 1961. She publishes her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Why was this book such a bombshell?
Because up until that point, the experts, the planners, the architects, the bureaucrats, they held all the cards. They had the degrees, the titles. They went to meetings with big maps and said, we know how to fix the city. Jane Jacobs was a journalist.
Right. She wasn't a planner.
She wasn't a planner. She was a mother living in Greenwich Village, looking out her window.
She was a regular person. An observer.
And she used that perspective to systematically dismantle their entire philosophy. She argued that the planners were looking at cities from an airplane view. They were looking for geometry, for order, for the separation of functions. She looked at the city from the sidewalk.
The famous ballet of the sidewalk.
Yes. She pointed out that what the planners called chaos, the mix of shops, apartments, bars, people sitting on stoops, was actually a very sophisticated system of social order and safety.
She coined the phrase eyes on the street, right?
Eyes on the street. A busy street is a safe street because shopkeepers and neighbors are constantly, informally watching out for each other.
So when the planners came in and separated everything housing over here in this sterile tower, the shopping mall way over there, the park over there, they were actually removing the natural safety mechanisms of the community.
Exactly. She also argued that cities need old buildings.
Why old buildings?
Because old buildings have lower rents, and lower rents allow for small businesses, for artists, for weird little bookshops, for diversity. New construction is always expensive, so it only attracts big chain stores and banks. It's sterile.
She famously went toe-to-toe with Robert Moses, the master builder of New York, who wanted to run a highway right through Lower Manhattan.
And she won. She and her community activists beat him, and that victory sparked a movement. You had the freeway revolts popping up all across the country.
San Francisco is a great example of it.
Oh, huge. The state of California wanted to wrap San Francisco in freeways. It would have destroyed entire neighborhoods. And the citizens mobilized. The protests were so intense that in 1966, Mayor Joseph Alioto actually stood up and repudiated the entire urban renewal plan.
And they stopped the freeways.
They did. If you go to San Francisco today, you can literally see the stumps where the highways just stop in midair. The infamous Embarcadero Freeway was eventually torn down after the 1989 earthquake, and it completely reconnected the city to its waterfront. It was a huge victory.
And Boston, too, right?
Yes, activists in Boston managed to stop the Southwest Expressway, although there's a tragic detail there.
What's that?
They stopped it after 3 miles of land had already been cleared, so the neighborhood was destroyed, the people were displaced, but the road was never actually built.
That is a special kind of failure. Just a scar on the land. But these protests did lead to real policy changes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we aren't doing 1950s-style slum clearance anymore.
The policy definitely shifted. The pendulum swung. By the 1970s, you get the Uniform Relocation Assistance Act, and this finally acknowledged that if the government takes your house, they actually owe you decent compensation for your moving expenses, not just the devalued price of your home.
Okay.
And then in 1974, the Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG program, changed the focus. Instead of federal money for demolish and rebuild, the focus shifted to rehabilitate and preserve.
So less dynamite, more renovation.
Generally, yes. The era of the federal bulldozer, for the most part, came to an end.
I want to pivot now to the how. We've talked about the history, but what are the tools in the modern urban renewal toolbox? Because even if we aren't using the term slum clearance as much, the mechanisms of taking land still exist.
They do.
We touched on eminent domain earlier, but there is a modern case that really redefined it for the 21st century. Kelo v. City of New London.
This case is absolutely critical for understanding modern redevelopment. It happened in 2005, and the fallout is still being felt today.
So set the scene for us. What happened in New London?
Okay, so you have Suzette Kelo. She owned a house in New London, Connecticut. It was a little pink house with a view of the water.
Okay.
Her neighborhood was not a slum. It was a working-class neighborhood, maybe a bit tired, but perfectly fine. The city, however, was struggling economically, and they struck a deal with a private development corporation. They wanted to clear the entire neighborhood to build a new research facility and conference center, hoping to attract Pfizer, the pharmaceutical giant, which was building a new headquarters nearby.
So the city tried to take her house using eminent domain. But usually eminent domain is for a clear public use, a road, a school, a military base. This was for a private developer.
And that was exactly her argument. Kelo sued the city. She argued, you can't take my private property and give it to another private party just because they might pay more taxes than I do.
Seems like a pretty foundational argument for property rights. What did the Supreme Court say?
They ruled against her. In a very controversial 5-4 decision, they expanded the definition of public use to include public benefit.
What does that mean?
They said that because the new development might bring jobs and might bring more tax revenue, it served a public purpose, and therefore the taking of her home was constitutional.
That feels like a massive loophole. Theoretically, couldn't a city use that logic to take my house and give it to a Walmart just because Walmart generates more tax revenue than I do?
That was precisely the argument made in the dissenting opinion. It made every home and small business in the country vulnerable to corporate interests with a better development plan. But here is the tragic epilogue to the Kelo story.
Oh, no.
Suzette Kelo lost her home, her neighbors lost their homes, the entire neighborhood was bulldozed, and then the financing for the big development fell through.
You're kidding me.
Pfizer eventually pulled out of the area entirely. The development was never built. For years, the land where Suzette Kelo's little pink house stood was just a vacant field of weeds used as a dumping ground for storm debris.
That is infuriating.
Okay.
It's just so senseless.
It is the ultimate example of what's called speculative future development. And you see this Rust Belt phenomenon in places like Syracuse, Cincinnati, Niagara Falls. Cities get desperate for a turnaround. They clear entire neighborhoods for a developer who promises the moon.
And then the market shifts.
The market shifts, the developer walks away, and the city is left with nothing but a surface parking lot where a community used to be.
Let's talk about another financial tool I see mentioned constantly in these documents. TIF, tax increment financing. It sounds boring, but apparently it's how everything gets built these days.
TIF is the magic wand of modern municipal finance. It's a little complex, but it's really important to understand.
Okay, walk us through it.
Here is how it works, simply. A city designates a certain area as a TIF district, an area they want to redevelop. They look at how much tax revenue that district is generating right now. Let's say, for argument's sake, it's $1 million a year. They freeze that number. That's the baseline.
Okay, baseline is set at $1 million.
Then the city borrows a bunch of money by issuing bonds, and they use that money to fix up the infrastructure in that district. New roads, new sewers, new sidewalks, maybe a park. The theory is that these public improvements will make the area more attractive, so property values will rise.
And when property values rise, tax revenues rise.
Exactly. But here's the trick. The schools, the police, the fire department, they still only get that original frozen $1 million from that district. All the new tax money, the increment above that baseline, doesn't go into the general fund. It goes directly into a special account to pay off the debt for the improvements.
So they're betting on the future to pay for the present.
That's a perfect way to put it. It allows cities to fund big development projects without technically raising taxes on everyone today. When it works, it can be a great tool. But if the property values don't rise as much as they predicted, or if critics argue they would have risen anyway without the subsidy, then you're just diverting tax money away from schools and essential services to pay off a bad bet made years ago.
Let's move to a different kind of strategy. Event-led renewal. The Olympics strategy.
Or the Bilbao effect, as it's often called.
Right, let's start with Bilbao. This is the Guggenheim Museum story.
Yes. Bilbao, Spain, was a gritty, fading industrial port city in the 1990s. It was not a tourist destination. They decided to gamble, and gamble big. They hired the famous architect Frank Gehry to build the Guggenheim Museum right on the derelict waterfront.
That crazy titanium spaceship of a building.
It is an architectural masterpiece, and it worked. It completely worked. Millions of tourists flocked to see the building itself. It revitalized the local economy. It completely rebranded the city from industrial rust to cultural hotspot, and it spurred all kinds of other developments around it.
And now every post-industrial city in the world wants an iconic museum or a star architect-designed concert hall to save them.
They do. They all want their own Bilbao effect.
But does it usually work? Or is Bilbao the exception that proves the rule?
Bilbao is largely the exception. For every Bilbao, there are dozens of cities that built a massive convention center or a jagged glass museum that sits empty most of the year. You can't just drop a shiny object into a city and expect it to fix deep, systemic economic issues.
Let's take this global for a bit. We've been very US-centric, but urban renewal is a worldwide phenomenon. Let's look at the UK again, but more recently, the London Docklands.
The Docklands is a fascinating and controversial case. In the 1980s, the shipping industry had moved to huge container ports further down the river. The historic East London docks were just miles of abandoned, derelict wasteland. The Thatcher government created a special urban development corporation to redevelop it, and they specifically bypassed the local planning councils to speed things up.
And they built Canary Wharf.
They built Canary Wharf, which is basically a second financial district to rival the historic city of London. Massive skyscrapers, global banks, high-end apartments. Economically, you can't argue with it. It generated huge wealth and tax revenue.
But socially?
Social, it's very complicated. It was heavily criticized for being an island of incredible wealth that was just dropped into one of the poorest parts of London. You have bankers making millions a year in these glass towers, and just a few streets away, you have some of the most deprived communities in the country that saw very little trickle-down benefit from it all.
Now, let's go to Singapore. Whenever I read about urban planning or public policy, Singapore is held up as the gold standard of getting things done.
Singapore is the success against all odds narrative. In the 1960s, it was a tiny island nation with no natural resources, and a huge percentage of the population lived in squatter settlements and overcrowded, unsanitary slums.
Right.
The government, led by Lee Kuan Yew, embarked on one of the most aggressive and comprehensive public housing programs in world history, the HDB, the Housing and Development Board.
They cleared the slums and moved basically everyone into high-rise apartment blocks.
Yes. And today, Singapore is famously clean, efficient, safe, and wealthy. Over 80% of the population lives in this public housing. It's a remarkable achievement. But there is a trade-off.
There's always a trade-off.
A scholar named Professor Kenneth Paul Tan has written about this. He argues that the constant tearing down and rebuilding, this national obsession with the new, has led to a profound loss of a sense of place.
The collective memory again.
Exactly. If the building you grew up in is gone, and the shop your grandfather went to is gone, and the entire street layout has changed 3 times in your lifetime, do you still feel rooted to your city? Tan suggests that the culture of comfort, the universal air conditioning, the pristine shopping malls is a kind of compensation for the loss of heritage and community memory.
That's a fascinating psychological trade-off. Comfort for memory. What about China? The scale there must just be mind-boggling.
It is unparalleled. For the last 30 years, the main strategy was called Old Town Reconstruction, and it was just massive, massive demolition. Entire historic neighborhoods, the famous Hutongs in Beijing, the Lilong in Shanghai, were bulldozed to make way for high-rise apartments and shopping centers.
But I've heard that is shifting recently. There's a change in approach.
There is, yes. In the last few years, particularly in cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou, there's a big move towards micro-renovation. So instead of drawing the character Chai, which means demolish on the wall, they're going in and fixing the plumbing, adding modern public toilets, repairing roofs, reinforcing structures, but keeping the old alleyways and the community fabric intact. It's an acknowledgement that the historic fabric has a value that a generic concrete tower just doesn't.
I want to touch on one more global example from the notes because it's so unique in its motivation. Israel, the TAMA 38 program.
This is really interesting because the primary driver isn't economics or aesthetics, it's safety.
Safety.
Yeah. Israel has a lot of old concrete apartment blocks called binyane rekevet, which means train buildings because they're long and linear. They were built quickly and cheaply in the 50s and 60s. The problem is they are not earthquake safe, and Israel sits on a major fault line.
And they don't have bomb shelters.
Exactly. And a safe room, or mabed, is a mandatory requirement in all new construction in Israel now. But the state can't afford to tear down and rebuild all these thousands of old buildings. So they created TAMA 38.
What is that?
It's a market mechanism. A private developer comes to one of these old buildings. They agree to seismically reinforce the entire building's foundation against earthquakes. And they add a brand new concrete reinforced safe room to every single existing apartment.
For free. How does the developer get paid?
Here's the clever part. In exchange for doing all that work for free, the city grants the developer the right to build 2 or 3 new floors of luxury penthouse apartments on top of the old building. They sell those new units at a huge profit.
That is incredibly clever. You're financing public safety through private densification?
It is. It's not perfect. It causes parking nightmares and it strains the old infrastructure, but it's a really creative way to renew the housing stock without displacing a single one of the original residents.
Okay, we have to talk about a failure, a spectacular one. The outline points us directly to Niagara Falls, New York.
Aw, poor Niagara Falls. It is the textbook case study of how not to do urban renewal.
Set the scene. It's the 1960s. You have one of the great natural wonders of the world right there. Millions of tourists are coming every year. What do?
The city leaders felt that the downtown area that served the tourists was tacky and outdated. They wanted to modernize, so they demolished most of the historic downtown.
They knocked down the downtown of a tourist city, the very thing the tourists came to see besides the water.
Yes. And they replaced it with a series of what were called silver bullets. Big mega projects, a massive convention center designed by the famous architect Philip Johnson, a factory outlet mall called the Rainbow Center, and a huge enclosed glass greenhouse thing called the Winter Garden.
And why was this a complete disaster?
Because they ignored every single fundamental rule of how a city works, especially a tourist city. The convention center was placed physically across Falls Street, the main artery that led to the falls. It blocked the flow of traffic and pedestrians. You could no longer see the falls from the city.
They turned their back on their main attraction.
They literally did. The Winter Garden was a giant glass wall that blocked the street grid. The mall was internally focused. It killed all the street life. They tried to turn an outdoor, walkable city into an indoor, mall-based suburban experience.
How did that work out?
It was a catastrophe. The small businesses all died. Tourists would drive in, park in a massive concrete ramp, go to the mall, and then leave. There was no reason to walk around, and within 20 to 30 years, the mall failed, the Winter Garden was demolished, and the convention center was repurposed because it was obsolete.
They destroyed the city to save it and ended up with neither.
Exactly. It shows that renewal isn't just about building big, shiny things. It's about the connective tissue, the street grid, the simple ability to walk from A to B and see something interesting along the way.
So let's bring it up to the present day. We are in the 2020s. The bulldozers are mostly parked. What are the modern trends in renewal?
Well, we are seeing the rise of the culturepreneur.
That sounds like a buzzword.
It is, 100%, but it describes a real strategy. It's about using culture art galleries, pop-up venues, urban beaches, food truck festivals to revitalize an area. Instead of one giant top-down government plan, you have smaller, temporary, bottom-up interventions that create a vibe.
And that vibe attracts people, which eventually attracts more permanent investment.
That's the theory. And then you have green renewal, which is a huge trend.
Like the High Line in New York.
The High Line is the global poster child.
Yeah.
Taking a piece of obsolete industrial infrastructure and turning it into a beautiful, elevated park. Or you see projects like the Regenesis project in South Carolina, which focused on cleaning up industrial pollution and creating community gardens. It frames renewal around environmental justice and sustainability, not just economics.
But even with beautiful parks and cool art galleries, we still have the elephant in the room, don't we? Gentrification.
That is the gentrification dilemma. It's the central problem of 21st century urban renewal. We might not be using dynamite anymore, but we have what's called indirect displacement.
Okay, so how does that work?
The city improves a neighborhood, they add that beautiful park, they put in better streetlights, maybe a new bike lane. The neighborhood becomes more desirable. So what happens?
Rents go up.
Rents go up, property taxes go up. The original low-income residents, the ones who stuck it out through all the bad times, suddenly can't afford to live in their own renewed neighborhood anymore. They get priced out.
So the end result is the same as the bulldozer. The original community is gone, but the mechanism is market forces, not a wrecking ball.
Exactly. And cities are really wrestling with this. It's a huge ethical problem. In 2016, the city of Portland, Oregon, formally apologized for its history of renewal.
They apologize.
They did. They admitted that urban renewal funds that were meant to help the poor were instead used to subsidize luxury apartments that pushed thousands of Black residents out of their historic neighborhoods in North and Northeast Portland.
So after all this, from the Devil's Acre to the High Line, from Baron Haussmann to Suzette Kelo, how do we synthesize this? Is urban renewal a good thing or a bad thing?
It is a tool. That is the only honest way to view it. A hammer can build a house, or it can break a window. Urban renewal has, without question, cleared dangerous, disease-ridden slums and created safer, healthier environments for millions of people. It has created powerful economic engines like Singapore or London's Canary Wharf.
Fun.
But the cost has so often been paid by the most vulnerable among us. The cost is that collective memory. When you erase a Syrian town or a hill district or a Black Bottom, you are severing the connection people have to their own history. You are prioritizing a certain kind of efficiency, the highway, the mall, over the messy vitality of a real place.
It brings us right back to that mission we started with, the constant battle between progress and place.
And I think for you, for the listener, the so what here is to look at your own city. The next time you see a trendy new arts district or you drive over a highway overpass that cuts through a neighborhood, ask yourself, what was here before?
Who lived here? And where do they go?
Exactly. Because the ground beneath our feet has layers of history. Most urban renewal is driven by the state deciding what is important based on its own narrative at that particular time. In the 50s, highways were important. Today, maybe it's tech campuses or biotech labs.
And here's a final thought for you to chew on. We always assume that blight is something that happens to other neighborhoods, the so-called bad parts of town. But we've learned today that the definition of blight is subjective. It's a political choice, a label. If the narrative changes again, could your neighborhood be next on the map?
It's happened before. It can happen again.
On that cheery note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Go look up the history of your own street. You might be surprised by what you find. We'll see you next time.